Hello, dear chess fans. My name is Eugene Grinis. Welcome to my free chess school from beginners to advanced, open for everyone who want to improve own game. This video is intended for the beginners. Even though the pawn is the least powerful part of your chess army, in some ways it is the most significant. Many times the way the pawns are arranged determines what is your best plan, and many times your best plan is to change the way the pawns are arranged. First, let's understand what makes the pawn so important. The way the pawns are arranged in any chess position is called the pawn structure. There are three reasons why the pawns are especially important. First, because there are so many pawns and because they are worth so much less than the pieces, the position of the pawns limits and determines how the pieces can move. Since a piece normally cannot allow itself to be captured by a pawn, the squares that the pawn controls are off limits to the pieces. And that means it's important to use your pawns to control as many squares as possible and to control the right squares. Second, because they move forward but capture diagonally, pawns often block each other. When this happens, they become a kind of fixed feature of the position, and the pieces have to move around them. So not only the pawns limit and determine how the pieces can move, by what squares they control, they also do so but by what squares they are on. Third, because pawns only move forward and never move backward, each pawn move is a commitment. Put a pawn on a bad square and you may be stuck with it for the whole game. So you have to be extra careful to handle your pawns well. Without a doubt, the greatest chess player of the 18th century was the Frenchman André Philidor. He wrote The Analysis of Chess. This book is considered one of the classics of chess literature. In this book, Philidor introduced many of strategic elements, and he wrote, "The pawns are the soul of chess." As the pawns move forward, they open up diagonals for the bishops, protect other pieces, and often lead the way for attacks. They can pry open an opponent's king side, but they can also spell doom when they become weak and are then subject to capture. When pawns are on in front of the other, we refer to them as doubled pawns. Double pawns occur when a pawn captures and moves in front of another pawn. You should usually try to recapture with a piece rather than with a pawn to avoid the weakness of doubled pawns. In this position, black has not one but two sets of doubled pawns. White strategy is clear. white has doubled the white rooks on the c file and will on the next move capture the weak black pawn on c6. In contrast, the white pawn structure seems quite strong with no obvious weaknesses. As a result, black cannot easily mount a counterattack on white's position. The game could continue. e5. Pawns are generally more secure and harder to attack when they are connected and able to defend one another. By contrast, when the pawns are scattered around the board, they are easier to attack. Here white has two pawn islands. Pawn islands consist of a single pawn or group of side-by-side pawns that are separated from other pawns by open files. The white pawns on the A and B files form one island, while the white pawns on the D, E, F, G and H files form the other island. These pawns defend one another. By contrast, the black pawns in this position form four pawn islands and are considered much weaker. Three of the pawns have no neighbors. Therefore, if attacked, these pawns would need to be defended by rooks that have more important roles to play than to defend a lonely pawn. The general rule here is simple. During the game, try to have fewer pawn islands than your opponent. White plays rook takes pawn on c6, pawn takes pawn on d4, pawn takes pawn, rook takes pawn on d4, rook takes pawn on c7, rook d2, attacking the pawn, rook 1 to c2, rook f to d8, b3, rook takes rook on c2, rook takes rook. White has an extra pawn and a better pawn structure. He has two pawn islands and black has three pawn islands. Black has doubled pawns and isolated pawns. White has large advantage in the endgame. Generally speaking, pawns are best placed when there are two or sometimes three abreast. When they are in this formation, all the squares they control are lined up on the same rank, which maximizes their effectiveness. Let's take a look at the following opening moves. e4, d6, d4, knight f6, knight c3, g6, knight f3, bishop g7, bishop e2, castle. This is a standard position from an opening called pure defense. Black does not stand too badly. He has developed about as well as white, and he has good enough squares on which to develop his last two minor pieces. But most grandmasters agree that white has a small advantage in this position, thanks mainly to his powerful pawn duo on e4 and d4, which control the center squares very well. In fact, this pawn duo is so powerful that it is essential for black to challenge it by advancing one of his pawns to the 5th rank after proper preparation, either the d pawn to d5, the c pawn to c5, or the e pawn to e5, most common. When two pawns stand side by side as the pawns on d4 and e4, they are called a pawn duo. Another reason the pawn stands well side by side is that since each pawn controls the square in front of its neighbor, each pawn supports the other's possible advance. This gives the pawns maximum dynamic potential. When a pawn duo has few or no pawns opposing it, the duo can be terribly strong. Pawns are born in a chain, stretching from one side of the board to the other, but as they advance, they become separated. Often they form little groups, sometimes even becoming isolated from their fellows. Let's take a look at some of the common ways pawns form groups. A pawn chain is a string of pawns that protect one another from beginning to end. In many openings, the pawns form chains along a diagonal. The pawn at the rear of the chain is the weakest because no other pawn defends it. The best strategy is to aim your attack at the rear of your opponent's pawn chain. Let's take a look at the following opening moves: e4, e6, the French defense, d4, d5, e5. The strategic battle in some openings is whether one side's pawn chain can be preserved. Such a battle occurs in the advanced variation of the French defense. Black and white both establish pawn chains. Black tries to destroy white's pawn chain, and white tries to preserve it, or allows it to be destroyed only under conditions favorable to white. You destroy a pawn chain by attacking it with pawns and pieces. You preserve it by propping it up with pawns and pieces. Sometimes the question of whether a pawn chain will be preserved or destroyed can be answered by counting. c5, c3. Pawn chains make it difficult to maneuver from one side of the board to another. They also provide a clue as to where both players will undertake future operations. White's pawn chain points to the king side, and that's where white advantage is. Black counters with operations on the queen side. Knight c6, knight f3, queen b6, a3. Moves that may otherwise seem inexplicable can sometimes be understood when the fight to maintain or destroy a pawn chain takes place. The pawn structure often serves as a guide to what the opening strategy should be. c4. In this position, both white and black have pawn chains. White pawn chain consists of the pawn on b2, c3, d4, and e5. Black's pawn chain includes the pawns on c4, d5, e6, and f7. Pawn chains can be very useful in cutting off your opponent's pieces and hindering mobility. Meanwhile, you can form an attack while your opponent is trying to break through the wall. Note that 3 of 4 white pawns are defended. The most advanced white pawn on e5 is defended by the pawn on d4. The pawn on d4 is defended by the pawn on c3. The pawn on c3 is defended by the pawn on b2. By contrast, the white pawn on b2 is completely undefended. The pawn in the rear of the chain is considered the weakest of the pawns precisely because the other pawn can no longer protect it. The weak pawn in the chain often becomes the main target of the attack by your opponent. The strategy involves with many chess openings can only be understood by considering the pawn structure. If your pawn structure is solid and you can damage your opponent's structure, you gain an advantage out of the opening. At the start of the game, the pawn structure is rock solid as the pawns stand shoulder to shoulder on their rank in front of the pieces. The pawns do, however, have to be disturbed in order to develop the pieces. Pawns can't move backwards, so every advance is a commitment, but one that must be made. Let's take a look at the following opening moves. d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4, pinning the knight, a3, attacking the bishop. Bishop takes knight on c3, check. Pawn takes bishop. When two pawns of the same color are in the same file, they are referred to as doubled. This is normally a positional weakness. The mobility of the pawns in back is compromised. You can't use it to protect the pawn in front. Some openings are designed to affect the position with doubled pawns. The Sämisch variation of the Nimzo-Indian Defence is one such opening. The pawns on c3 and c4 are doubled. Black's subsequent opening strategy is to attack the pawn on c4 and to tie white's pieces down in defense. Pieces that get stuck doing guard duty may drift into passivity. All things being equal, double pawns represent a weakness. If you can exchange one of them for one of your opponent's healthy pawns, by all means do so. Some double pawns are strong. Many beginning players become so fearful of doubling their pawns that they miss situations when double pawns can be strong. In this position, the black knight captures on the e3 square. Knight takes bishop on e3. White could automatically recapture with the queen to avoid doubling the white pawns on the e file. White decides that capturing with the pawn has some advantage that overweight the structural weakness of doubling the pawns. Pawn takes knight on e3. The new pawn on e3 helps to support the white center by defending the white d4 pawn. More important, by recapturing with the pawn, white has opened up the f file for the rook. Having both the queen and the rook on the open file and the strengthened center more than compensates for the doubled pawns and the extra pawn island. White is better here. Isolated pawn. Simply put, isolated pawns are single pawn islands that have no pawns on either side. Such pawns therefore cannot be defended by a pawn. Even without help, such pawns can advance aggressively, but all too often isolated pawns are blocked, attacked and captured. Let's take a look at this position. The pawn on d4 is an example of an isolated pawn. More often than not, isolated pawns are weaknesses in one's position. The reason is that it is impossible for a teammate to protect an isolated pawn. Black plays bishop f6. The bishop on f6 attacks the pawn on d4, but white has no effective way of protecting the pawn. When there are no pawns on the same color on either of the files next to it, we say that the pawn is isolated. The isolated pawn has the potential to be a bad weakness for two reasons. First, it must be defended by pieces and then can be hard to do, and that had become hard to do. Second, the side with the isolated pawn can't control the squares in front of it with pawns, so the opponent can use those squares more easily. All weak pawns have a common drawback. They lack pawn support and may turn into wonderful targets for the opponent's pieces. White plays b3. Bishop takes pawn on d4. Black has the extra pawn. The isolated pawn isn't always a bad thing. The isolated pawn usually wants to advance, both in order to gain space and in order to exchange the pawn for another pawn. Therefore, it's crucial for the player who does not have the isolated pawn to control the square in front of it. The side with the isolated pawn wants to keep as many pieces as possible on the board. The side playing against the isolated pawn wants to exchange pieces, because in this case the weakness of the isolated pawn will become more important. Let's take a look at this position. This is the typical position with white's isolated queen pawn on d4. Note that not only a pawn itself may be weak, a square in front of it may be weak too, being deprived of pawn defense. The game continues. Knight e5. The white knight on e5 occupies a key square right in the center of the board, where the black pawns will not easily be able to attack it. Knight b d5. Similarly, the black knight on d5 blockades white's isolated d-pawn. From these key squares, the knights will often have opportunities to lash out with forks or to assist the attacks on each other's king. If an enemy piece is positioned in front of an isolated pawn, driving it away may be impossible. In that case, the isolated pawn's mobility is halted. The term chess players use for such a situation is blockade. The fight for control over the square in front of an isolated pawn can be the main strategy in certain openings. In the Queen Gambit Accepted, white is often saddled with an isolated d-pawn. White tries to execute the advance d4, d5 when possible, and black tries to prevent it. If white succeeds, the isolated pawn will be eliminated or used to disrupt the organization of black's pieces. If black succeeds in blockading the pawn, however, white's position may become weak. If you have an isolated pawn, try to advance it and exchange it for a healthy one of your opponent's. If your opponent has an isolated pawn, try to prevent its advance. This position offers roughly equal chances to both players. When three pawns are opposed to each other in some such position, there is always a chance for the active side of obtaining a passed pawn. White plays b6. The way of obtaining a passed pawn is to advance the center pawn. Pawn a7 takes pawn on b6. If pawn c7 takes pawn on b6, then a6, attacking the b7 pawn. The pawn has to be taken. c6. Promoting the pawn. White is winning. For example, king f7, c7, king e7. Too late. White promotes the pawn, winning. Let's go back to the game. b6, pawn a7 takes pawn b6. White plays c6, attacking the b7 pawn. The pawn has to be taken. a6, and white wins. Which pawn queens first? In this position, whoever moves first wins. The first thing is to find out by counting whether the opposing king can be in time to stop the passed pawn from queening. When, as in this case, it cannot be done, the point is to count which pawn comes in first. In this case, the time is the same, but the pawn that reaches the last square first and becomes a queen is in a position to capture the opponent's queen when he makes one. a4, h5, a5, h4, b6. Pawn takes pawn on b6. Now comes a little calculation. White can capture the pawn on b6, but if he does so, he will not, when queening, control the square h1, where black will also queen his pawn. Let's see. Pawn takes pawn on b6, h3, b7, h2, white queens, and black queens too, with a draw. Therefore, instead of taking the b6 pawn, white pushes his a pawn, pawn takes pawn on b6, a6, the key move, h3, a7, h2, white queens and wins the game. Okay, that's the lesson for today from the Eugene Grinis Chess School. I hope it was useful and you enjoyed it. If so, push likes, subscribe to my YouTube channel and leave comments. Goodbye.